We'll get right into our next session, looking into the future, opportunities and benefits of sustainability initiatives. So I'll invite those that are participating here to come on up. I'll introduce our session host. Our moderator is Carson Callum. Carson is the general manager for Manitoba Beef Producers. He grew up on a mixed grain and beef cattle farm south of Miami, Manitoba. He has a Bachelor of Science degree in Agriculture and a Master of Science degree from the University of Manitoba, where he majored in animal science. So welcome, Carson, and welcome to our panelists.
Well, thanks, Morris. I have to say I'm torn about the snow out there today. I know there's some positives with it, added moisture for the agricultural community next year. I know my son's excited about having a white Christmas. However, when I talk to my mother on the phone about it, she comes up with swear words I didn't know existed. So it's definitely a personal struggle for me to decide if this is a positive or negative. But at least we all made it here today for this great summit. So again, thanks for the introduction, Morris. I'm Carson Callum, General Manager with Manitoba Beef. Manitoba Beef Producers represents around 6,000 producers in the province, beef producers specifically, through different advocacy efforts, whether that's to industry, to government, or to the general public. So I'm very pleased to be here with all of you this morning to be your moderator for this session. So really the description was to highlight trends, opportunities, and initiatives, including protecting biodiversity as a link to the UN Biodiversity Conference, or COP15, that occurred in Montreal last week. So I'm joined with three wonderful panelists here. So I'll ask when I do your introduction that you stand up and wave or do a jumping jack. I'm kidding, but you can still stand up and wave for those in the back. So I'll start with Cher Meerweather. Well done. So Cher is one of Canada's leaders in the food industry for sustainability. As CEO for Anthesis Provision, Cher works directly with food companies to transform their business culture and operations. Cher is a passionate advocate for a healthy lifestyle that is deeply connected to the natural environment. The food system became an obvious source of study and focus for her professional career, as food is the nexus between environment and health. What Cher stands for is a world in which food and beverage products support both people and the planet. She has dedicated her career to working with businesses to get clear on why they exist, what their purpose is beyond profit, and to provide them with the support needed to execute the strategy so that the real magic can happen. Before founding Provision Coalition Incorporated, now Anthesis Provision, Cher's career had included time with Guelph Food Technology Center, which is now NSF International, where she established and directed sustainability consulting business unit, and executive positions in environmental economics and policy with Canadian Agri-Food think tank, the George Morris Centre. Cher holds a bachelor and master's degree in environmental economics and policy and is certified in both project and change management. Cher has also been awarded the Canadian Grocer Generation Next Award for her leadership, innovation, and excellence in sustainability within the food and beverage industry. So thank you, Cher, for being here with us. Next up, Carly Reimer. So Carly is passionate about conservation, sustainability, and agriculture. Growing up on a beef farm next to a Ducks Unlimited wetland project gave her firsthand experience on how nature and agriculture can and must work together. An international and national award-winning agricultural journalist and communicator, Carly's path led her straight to Ducks Unlimited, where she currently leads the marketing and communications for the conservation group's sustainability and agriculture initiatives. Carly is actively engaged on communication committees for various agriculture groups, such as the Canadian Roundtable for Sustainable Beef and the Soil Conservation Council of Canada. Her background in agricultural, former training in journalism, and role in communication at Ducks gives her a unique approach in sharing connection between conservation and sustainable agriculture within Canada. Carly is a Manitoba Softball Hall of Famer and even got married on a ball diamond. Impressive. When she's not coaching her daughter's softball team or on the diamond herself, Carly likes to travel and spend time gardening at home in Manitoba's Interlake region. So thanks again, Carly, for joining us. And last but not least, Andrea White. So Andrea is the Director of Marketing and Stakeholder Relations with the Canadian Roundtable for Sustainable Beef. She leads the development and implementation of marketing and communication strategy for the CRSB and its certified sustainable beef framework to align with the CRB's mission, vision, principles, and mandate. She is a key liaison and multi-stakeholder of the multi-stakeholder membership of the CRSB across the beef value chain and beyond, and supports the marketing initiatives in companies and organizations using the CRSB certified program. She serves on the Communication Council of the Global Roundtable for Sustainable Beef and participates in the Communication Working Group for the National Index on Agri-Food Performance. Andrea grew up in Winnipeg, received her Bachelor of Science in Biochemistry and Master's in Food Science from the University of Manitoba. She has a diverse background with experience in program management, stakeholder engagement, industry communications, marketing, policy development, food processing, research, and product development. So Andrea has recently returned to Manitoba after 20 years in Alberta and BC. So welcome back, Andrea. So before I pass it over to the panel, I just kind of want to set the stage a little bit for the discussion. So as Morris alluded to, I come from a cow-calf operation south of Miami, Manitoba. So I deeply respect the benefits that type of production system within the agricultural space can provide on the landscape. But when looking at a greater agricultural sector, I would say a big focus of our industry has been, over the last decade or more, productivity, yield, output, those sort of production metrics. And sometimes I feel as an agricultural community, and us included, are guilty of focusing strictly on that and not some of the secondary benefits of importance, such as sustainability metrics. Sometimes I feel as a sector we kind of lose the ability to see the forest for the trees. So I think we're at a bit of a crossroads here in Manitoba particularly. And really what I want to really come from this panel discussion and from the discussion today is, what sort of value do we put on some of these secondary benefits, such as biodiversity and the diverse landscape that agriculture can provide? Do we see value in it, or do we want to still see continued conversion of some of these marginal lands that are happening within Manitoba? So I really look forward to hearing the presentation today and discussing the importance of sustainability within our province and within the country as a whole. And I look forward to the wonderful panel speakers. So I'll first invite up Cher for her session.
Good morning, everyone. It's wonderful to be here. As Carson alluded to, I'm deeply passionate about nature, about just the landscape in general. And interestingly, one of my very first pieces of research early in my career was with Manitoba and the government, and we were setting out to determine whether or not we could pay farmers for ecological goods and services. Probably one of the most progressive pieces of research that I did, and I won't tell you how long ago, because that's just embarrassing, but the point being that Manitoba was always at the forefront of thinking differently about biodiversity. I did want to share that this little guy, while I don't live on a farm, I do live rural, he is my neighbor. And over the course of the summer, we became very good friends. And you could see that I got to the point where I could pet him and feed him. That's my grass that I'm feeding him. So deeply passionate about livestock also. Let's see. So for those of you who may not be familiar with Anthesis, this Saturday marks the one-year anniversary from when I sold the company to them. And we are the largest global consultancy focused solely on sustainability, and ridiculously proud of the fact that we are having incredible impact. We have set a public commitment of reducing 3 gigatons of carbon as a result of our impact through our clients. And for context, that is bigger than Walmart's commitment. This year, we were awarded the 2022 Sustainability Leaders Award out of Europe. In terms of a little bit about who we are, this is our nature practice. So we do all sorts of work when it comes to nature. Of course, the valuation of natural capital. We do biodiversity nature impact assessments. We do materiality assessments to understand what your material risks are with respect to nature. We can help you set up your science-based target initiatives and your forest landscape, et cetera, et cetera. So lots of experience across the global team to help you in this space. So what I want to do today, and this is not very responsive. Do I need to point it somewhere? There we go. I want to set the stage. I want to first start by looking at the deep interconnection between climate and biodiversity. And I'm going to come at this from a national and an international perspective, give you a sense of what we're seeing across our clients in terms of what is being asked of the food system, and as well as bringing it down to some of the specifics in terms of clients that we've worked with. So I think it's important to first set the stage and get a sense of, please work. Get a sense of the state of the industry. These are global stats. So the food system is responsible for 33% of all of the greenhouse gas emissions. We're responsible for 80% of the biodiversity loss, and we are responsible for 70% of the water consumption. And what is ironic about these stats is that we are the most vulnerable from the impact of it. So as a food system, we really need to figure this out. And as I like to say to my Anthesian colleagues, if we don't get food right, nothing else is going to matter. What we are starting to see and understand is that climate and biodiversity are deeply interconnected. As we see the focus and effort on climate, we're realizing that the biodiversity loss is a feeder into the climate extremes. We are seeing decreased resiliency to natural disasters as we lose biodiversity. Ecosystem destruction from deforestation is causing more climate impact. Habitat degradation, invasive species that are now surviving through winters, invasive species that are living in areas they never used to live in before, increased pollutants impacting both biodiversity and climate. Some areas that I think are key risks when we think about the livestock and meat industry. I'm not going to talk about all 5, but I'm going to suggest to you that all 5 are actually connected to biodiversity and climate. I am going to talk about the first 2 in detail, but I want to point out that we are in a labor crisis in the food system here in Canada. And what we do know is that purpose-driven companies who can demonstrate the impact that they want to have in the world are not having the same levels of crises around labor. And so when we think about our impact and our efforts around climate and biodiversity, that is an attractive thing for labor. Access to capital and insurance, these are all major issues for banks and investors, for insurance companies. They want to understand what the risks are to your business from climate, and I'm going to suggest to you that biodiversity is not far behind. And then alternative proteins, we know that consumer diets are changing, and that's okay. But what we do want is to be able to present livestock protein or animal protein as climate or biodiversity smart, so that when those consumers choose to eat meat products, that they can choose smartly. So let's look at carbon policy and expanded supply chain governance in a little bit more detail. So we know, I mentioned already, the demand for biodiversity is increasing. We know that climate is on the forefront. We know that, particularly in Canada, the government has already made a number of commitments. We have net zero by 2050, which essentially says that all of the carbon emissions that we produce have to be offset in some way, shape, or form, whether it's a reduction or an offset to get us to net zero. We have the Paris Agreement, which says by 2030 we need to have a 40 to 45% reduction from a 2005 baseline. We have national fertilizer emission reduction targets, and we have carbon tax commitments. That's what's happening at a national level on the climate side. So what we are also seeing within industry, and I'm going to show you a slide in a couple of moments, is that same level of commitment around climate. And what we are also seeing is a strong movement towards biodiversity in support of those climate commitments. Now on the screen, what you see are the percentages of companies, and this is a global stat, percentage of companies with a nature-related commitment and publicly reported target. And most companies are focusing on a time period between now and 2030. And that's largely driven by the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, which are all targeted at 2030. What this also means is that as companies are working to meet these commitments, they need information and data out of the supply chain. And so you're seeing that increasing pressure on farmers, processors, and manufacturers to produce information about what's happening within their supply chains. And so, not surprising, we're seeing a lot of expanded supply chain governance. We're seeing a lot of effort to collect information about what is happening in our supply chains. So these are just a smattering of examples at a retail level to give you a sense of what I'm talking about. So Walmart, they've made a commitment, a net zero commitment by 2040. So to help you understand, if you're not familiar with the net zero, what this is saying is that they have made a science-based target commitment to report their scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. The only way that they can report scope 3 emissions is if they collect all of their supplier emissions within their supply chain. So that means that all of their suppliers have to produce their own scope 1 and 2 owned and operated emissions reporting. Very complex, very big supply chains, very big initiative. At the same time, they are also very focused on regenerative agriculture, protect, restore, and sustainably manage at least 50 million square miles of land and 1 million square miles of ocean by 2030. Loblaws, they've also made a net zero commitment by 2040, and they're part of the One Planet business for biodiversity. So again, you're starting to see these interweaving of climate and biodiversity. Sobeys is focused on a net zero by 2050. They also have an ocean-wise seafood program, as does Loblaw. Metro, we're not seeing as much focus on the climate side. I'm sure it's happening, but public-facing, they're focused on their packaging. And I'm going to suggest to you that packaging is also part of biodiversity. The Canada Plastics Pact is looking to eliminate the amount of plastics that we're seeing in our water, in our soil, and in our human tissues. So that is also connected to biodiversity, as is food waste, but I'm not going to talk about food waste today. I know it's a shock. Costco, also working on their Scope 3 action plan, as well as focusing in on beef and soy in particular, and making sure that they are not having an impact on deforestation. Cisco, they're working with their suppliers by 2025 to get a sense of their science-based target initiatives for Scope 1 and 2, as well as building out a sustainable agriculture program. So again, all of this to say that we're seeing these connections between climate and biodiversity, and the pressure is coming around collection of information to deliver on this. We're part of the Canadian Agricultural Sustainability Initiative. We're building the platform to solicit data out of the food system so that we can aggregate it and report it in an efficient way. Wanted to show you another example, while not at the retail level, but it does show you that this is also happening for the big manufacturers. So this is an example out of Europe, but it does still speak to what is happening. So Arla, they make a number of dairy products. They are working across their supply chain to make sure that they have zero carbon emissions, and they are certifying it. So our group, Climate Neutral Group, is part of Anthesis. We've certified their products as carbon neutral. The only way that they could do that was working with their supply chain. Oftentimes, we hear about how agriculture is the problem. I opened with my stats about the state of the industry being unsustainable. But I want to focus today on the opportunities, because I think there are some significant opportunities. Please work. Come on. Patience, grasshopper. That is what it's teaching me. There we go. So the United Nations in their Food Systems Summit 2021, they were very clear that livestock is the millennial-long proven method to create healthy nutrition and secure livelihoods, and that sustainable livestock will also provide solutions for the additional challenges that we are facing. And I think this is key. When we're thinking about the food system, thank you, you're a darling. Yes, and I know how to work this one too. So this is what we need to remember, that livestock is the foundation here. So what are some of the opportunities that we are starting to see? We are certainly starting to see carbon sequestration and carbon credits. And again, I'm going to give you examples that are both global and in Canada. We're seeing opportunities for rotational grazing into crop rotations. We are seeing opportunities for nutrient management, disease, and antimicrobial resistance. And my examples will be all real world, and they'll focus specifically on livestock. Now, earlier this month, if you haven't seen it, Environment and Climate Change Canada released their nature-based climate solutions. And the two things that I want to point out that are really important to this discussion is that they clearly stated, this was the expert panel on Canada's carbon sink potential, forest, agricultural land, grassland, and peatland nature-based climate solutions have the highest national greenhouse gas mitigation potential over the next 3 decades. Cropland management and avoided grassland conversion hold the greatest potential for carbon sequestration in agriculture and grasslands. They were also clear to say that this is not going to solve all of our problems, but it is definitely part of the solution in the toolbox. And it makes sense. What other sector owns millions of acres and billions of trees? So what we need to focus on here is maximized sequestration. We need scientifically legitimate measurements of soil, crops, grasslands, and trees. We need to make sure that we are clear on what those cropland management techniques look like and how we're going to measure outcomes and how we are going to verify those outcomes. Here's a program that is also done by Anthesis in our climate neutral group. It does come out of South Africa, but what I want to show is that there is precedence that it is happening. And so in this case, the farmers in South Africa are being paid for their sustainable land management practices, including rotational grazing, cover cropping, reduced tillage, as well as other improvements in soil health. And they are receiving a payment for those carbon credits, and those carbon credits are then sold into the market. VG Meats out of Ontario as an example of a company that is focused on regenerative agriculture. This is a vertically integrated operation, so they really understand the complexities of farming, processing, and having a retail market. And they have implemented the Savory Institute's regenerative agriculture on their farm and operation. And what I really like about this is that their cattle is grazing right in the forests, it's grazing in the croplands. But what they are doing that is unique is they are trying to build a community-based solution in which they're engaging their community to see the value of buying their meat for the nature-based solutions that they're creating. So early days for them, but what they're trying to do is progressive. Biodynamic agriculture, so this case it's Southbrook Wineries, also a vertically integrated operation where they are growing the grapes, they are doing the wine, and they have a retail outlet. And in this case, they have sheep and chicken who are doing their lawn care, as they like to call it, in the actual where the grapes are being grown. And so they are certified biodynamic and doing really well as a result. And then my final example is Grand Valley Fortifiers. While you may not think of a feed conversion company as being part of the solution, in fact, they are a very important part of the solution. They are seen as a trusted partner for the farmers. And what they are trying to do is show up really powerfully on how they can use their feed conversion products to address some of the challenges that farmers are facing around sustainability. So really showing up as a solution. And part of what they're doing, and Ian, the CEO, allowed me to share this slide, is talk to their farmers about the fact that feed is their single biggest emission source and also their single biggest cost of production. And so if you can manage both of those pieces, you can actually be more sustainable, more efficient. A couple of great slides that he shared about just making sure that the focus is in the right area. Efficient, profitable, and sustainable can be all in one. So my call to action as I wrap up here is I really want to share some of the highlights coming out of COP15. So I've got a number of colleagues that are in Montreal, and what they have shared with me is that the three main things that they've heard over the last week is collaboration in a pre-competitive space. In order for us to truly transform the food system, to recognize the importance of nature and biodiversity, we are going to need to value our natural capital. We're going to need to value ecological goods and services. Those were the three main things: pre-competitive collaborations in order to achieve transformation of the system and valuing our natural capital. Now, if you haven't heard of the Capitals Coalition, this is a global effort to bring together a way to measure and account for the value of natural capital. So by 2030, their aspiration is to have the majority of businesses, financial institutions, and governments being able to include the value of natural capital, social capital, and human capital in their decision making. And they have produced the Natural Capital Protocol, which allows you to actually put natural capital on your balance sheet so that you can report the risk or the value of the natural capital that is in your business. And this is a really progressive piece. This summer, we had the privilege of doing a review of a number of different programs where we are attempting to pay farmers for that natural capital or ecological goods and services. And I want to share a few of them because I think that it demonstrates that it can be done, but I also want to give you a sense that it's happening around the world. I want to start here in Manitoba, of course, now branched out across 6 provinces, but Alice is a great point of how this can be done really successfully. Being able to pay farmers for those nature-based solutions that are being done. And we can see the impact by the numbers, $16 million being invested in the farmers, thousands and thousands of acres of change happening on the landscape. In the US, we see a similar program, Ecosystem Service Market Consortium, payments for ecological goods and services, and carbon credits. In Europe, we see a similar program, Climate Farmers. They're supporting farmers with the transition to regenerative agriculture, where they're paying for the services and the natural capital. But the one I want to pause on for a moment is a new initiative that we have the privilege of being a part of. It is going to launch this spring in 2023 in the city of Guelph County of Wellington. And what we are doing is we're going to build on the ALICE program. And what is unique about this is that we are engaging the entire supply chain as well as key stakeholders. So we've invited private investors, insurance, banking institutions to the table and said, what sort of outcomes do you want to achieve from the farmers? Go ahead and pay, and we will make sure that the farmers are delivering those outputs. So we will have incentives for the farmers to participate, to de-risk. We will have training and agronomic services to support them. And then we will have incentives, financial incentives for the outcomes once they're achieved. And we'll work with partners like Ducks Unlimited to validate the changes on the landscape. And so what's incredible about this is that what we are attempting to do is bring the market ask, the industry, what do you want from farmers, to the farmers, and have the farmers deliver it. So that's what is innovative and progressive about this work, and I'm super excited about it. So to summarize, as climate commitments continue to increase, you can expect the biodiversity commitments to follow. The Carbon Disclosure Project has already announced that they will have biodiversity included for the 2023 disclosures this year. We know that FLAG, which is the Forest Landscape and Agriculture, the Science-Based Target Initiatives, they're finalizing their pieces. Everybody's focusing on biodiversity. It is coming. And in order for us to truly get there, I believe we need to look at systems that will create pre-competitive collaboration in order to transform the food system, we need to really value our natural capital and ecological goods and services. So for those who are building out that Aspire program that we heard about, please make sure that we have the valuation of natural capital in it. With that, I will pause and pass it to. Wonderful.
Thank you again, Chair, for that presentation. I think the piece that resonated with me was the whole value component and how we do that. But yes, I'll pass it to you now.
Wonderful. And this one works better?
Yeah,
okay,
much.
Wasn't Cher wonderful? Oh, she's such a great speaker, and there's so much excitement that's coming in this space right now. So again, I'm Carly Reimer. I'm with Ducks Unlimited Canada. Just like our agricultural minister, I'm also a proud Interlaker, a proud Manitoban. I love speaking at events like this where we have such a great contingent of Manitobans and other Interlakers in the room that we can kind of really share a lot of our experiences and talk about the future, which is exactly what our panel is about today. So I'm going to focus a lot on biodiversity solutions. And I was actually very fortunate to be in Montreal last week as part of Team DU, Team Ducks, where we actually hosted an event at the UN's Biodiversity Conference, COP15, in the Canadian Pavilion. So it was a really special place in the Convention Centre in Montreal, where we actually, along with many of our agricultural partners across the country, came together to celebrate sustainable agriculture and really position modern ag as a solution provider when it comes to biodiversity, as well as our climate change impact. So the Canadian Cattle Association, the Canadian Roundtable for Sustainable Beef, the Dairy Farmers of Canada were all there beside us representing animal proteins and their sustainability solutions across the country. It was a well-attended event, and it was great that we could actually showcase the leadership that we have here in the country globally, and positioning ourselves in that way. So it was great. I am still riding a high a little bit from that event last week, and I know there's a lot of great discussions that my own colleagues at Ducks Unlimited Canada are having there still. So that's just a little kickback for COP15 and what our involvement from last week. I broke it. There we go. So, being Manitobans, a lot of Manitobans in the room, many of you will know who Ducks Unlimited Canada is. But for those that don't, we were established in 1938 by a group of waterfowlers, aka duck hunters, that in the Great Depression, that drought of the Great Depression, they found that there was not a lot of water on the land, and with that really impacted our waterfowl and wildlife populations. So a group of waterfowlers got together, and in 1938, right here in Manitoba, they established Duck Factory Number 1. So that is our very first project. We have deep roots in history here in Manitoba and on the prairies. And Ducks Unlimited Canada, we are a Canadian conservation company, was established here in Manitoba at Big Grass Marsh, which is just on the west side of Lake Manitoba, very close to where my colleague, many of you know, Christine Tapley, who also sits on the consortium, where she farms today. So from those humble beginnings in the Great Depression, we are now one of the largest, most trusted conservation organizations in the country. We are active in every province and territory, and we offer sustainable solutions with on-the-ground conservation actions. We have our own trusted scientific research arm called the Institute for Wetlands and Waterfowl Research, and we have collaborative partnerships with governments and industries at all levels. Plus, we're using some pretty great technologies now, too. And we invest in sustainable landscapes. Right from the local level to advancing land use planning, to conservation programming provincially, regionally, and nationally, we work with others to conserve, restore, and manage Canada's habitats for the benefits of our environment as well as the wildlife and people. So here's a wetland. It's kind of winter, it's really snowy out right now. So natural areas like this wetland and the surrounding grasslands are very special, important places here on the Canadian landscape. And these areas, not just here in Manitoba, but across the country, are punching above their weight class when it comes to all the benefits they provide. So these areas are critical to creating resilient landscapes, mitigating climate change, and sustainable food production. And they offer a long list of environmental benefits that often get forgotten about. They're really great for our communities, for our rural economy, and they offer carbon storage potential, flood and drought mitigation. They filter our nutrients, they clean our water, and they're hot spots for biodiversity, wildlife, and pollinators. So these are very special places that we need to really focus on when it comes to our biodiversity outcomes. And speaking of biodiversity, biodiversity is a critical component of the health of our Canadian landscapes. Biodiversity is good for agriculture, and agriculture is good for biodiversity. These things need to go hand in hand. And the science is now finally demonstrating this, which is really important. Agriculture areas that include habitat can actually increase the productivity and improve crop yields through pollination services. And I know Carson was explaining how, we are really focused on that output and those productivity and the yields, but we're really just starting to realize that biodiversity is really benefiting those things, and those things we are still, are really important to our operations and to our economic viability. But despite benefits like these and all of the environmental goods and services that these areas provide, wetlands and grasslands are still under threat and often undervalued. So you're going to see this is going to transition. So take a look at this slide. Really is just a simple graphic to show as we lose habitat like wetlands, grasslands, pollinator areas, shelter belts, treed areas, we actually lose the habitat potential of that specific landscape. As we simplify a landscape, the ability to sustain the wildlife, the biodiversity, both above and below ground, becomes lessened. So land use change is the single largest practice impacting biodiversity and habitat today. As the land use changes, so does its impact on biodiversity and wildlife. And so coming out of COP15, you may have heard there is a biodiversity crisis on our hands. Thankfully, we do have solutions, and those are some of the things I'm going to touch on today. So my goal is really to have everyone leave today reconsidering our land use management and decisions. There is a better way, and biodiversity and our habitat, will benefit from it. And we do need to work together collaboratively to reduce the downward trends of biodiversity loss. But what can we do? So first, and I don't think this should be a surprise coming from Ducks Unlimited Canada, is we need to stop bringing new land into production. We need to farm the best and conserve the rest. And that means by growing more on less land, which we also refer to as sustainable intensification. And we do that through the use of science, research, and technology. So we are really optimizing what we're doing on the best available acres that grow our food, our fuel, and our fiber. And so we are actually leaving those areas that are marginal, where we retire them, we repurpose them, so they can actually provide those environmental benefits that we need. Right now, when it comes to marginal areas, Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada has actually said that 28% of the prairies are economically and environmentally unsustainable. That just points to a huge opportunity that we have all across the country when it comes to these areas that could be repurposed for the benefit of carbon, of water filtration, for biodiversity and wildlife and pollination services. And again, this is above and below ground. When we think of biodiversity, we often think of critters, something covered in fur, running around, but there is so much life in our soil, and soil health is such an important part of all of this. Soil is a living, breathing organism, and by keeping the ground covered, by having a growing, living root, by working with, livestock integration, all of these principles really will keep biodiversity healthy, it'll keep our landscapes healthy, and it'll help us with our sustainable food production. So how do we support the ag industry? And that's always, where do farmers and ranchers benefit from this? How do we work with agriculture to make some of these changes? Well, by putting science tools to work, by putting our research to work. And we use some pretty cutting edge science at Ducks, and we're quite proud of all of the tools and technologies that we're able to use. And so here's an example of a crop field. And so this is just a profit map. It's a yield map that shows where you are actually making money, where you're losing money, if you're, what your return on investment is when it comes to a crop landscape. And this is just a really good tool to help us work with farmers to show them that there are areas that actually could be set aside for conservation, for biodiversity, for all those other societal environmental benefits, and we can put them to better use. This is one that we're actually quite excited about. This is brand new. I think you're maybe the first group that might be hearing about this. This is our new biodiversity mapping and assessment tool. And so we are actually investing in technologies like this with our researchers from the Institute for Wetlands and Waterfowl Research. And this will estimate how land use impacts biodiversity, how conservation actions, such as habitat restoration of wetlands and grasslands and other natural areas, can contribute to biodiversity outcomes. And so this is the first step in managing and measuring our risks to biodiversity, and it is a tool that the companies we work with can benefit from because it'll help them establish their own biodiversity baselines, show that any of the impact work they do on the landscape, what that actually means in terms of biodiversity. And this is specific to biodiversity and wildlife, but we also have tools that we can now establish baselines when it comes to land conversion, agricultural practices, and carbon and greenhouse gas emissions. So we have an entire suite of tools and technologies that we are really starting to better understand the impact of our work and the work of our partners on the landscape, so we can actually show consumers, governments, and others that we work with that what we're doing is actually quite impactful. So I want to mention working with farmers and ranchers. So supporting them and recognizing them for the EGS, so monetization is the word I'll use, but it's basically rewarding farmers and ranchers for the environmental benefits that come from their land. This will help turn wetlands, grasslands, and other natural areas from being potential liabilities to financial assets. We need to start looking at these areas differently. They are not a risk to have them on the landscape. They actually perform and, like I said, punch above their weight and provide us a slew of benefits that we need, not just agriculturally or in our rural communities, but as a public good for all of society. So farmers need to be recognized for more than just the food they produce. And that recognition will help reduce the loss of these really special, important places on our landscape. But these markets have to be developed, and they need to support landowners first. And Cher really went through a lot of great examples of where this is happening. Ducks Unlimited Canada, we have our own programs where we are incentivizing conservation actions on the ground. We are looking at markets. We are partnering with others just to make sure that everything we can do to support these biodiversity outcomes, climate change resiliency is actually happening, and it is really benefiting producers. We cannot continue to rely on the goodwill of some of the stewards, to do and protect what little habitat we have left. Their good graces are only going to go so far. We really need to support them because they need to be recognized for what they're doing on the landscape when it comes to conservation. This is our vision for agricultural sustainability. And, we often get that question, why is, Ducks Unlimited Canada so invested in agriculture and agricultural partnerships? Well, simply all of the land that is important to us in conserving, restoring, managing is located and under private land ownership. So for us, we need to meet the demand for food. But to do that, it also needs to be scalable. We need to be able to have a large landscape level impact. We need to work not only with small farmers and ranchers, but those that own a lot of the land and have a lot of influence on the land. But that also has to be economically viable for those producers, and through incentives incentives and other, policies and initiatives, we're hoping that will be the case. Plus, we also need to have pragmatic partnerships. And I think we're going to see a theme of that today quite a bit. It's that collaboration, that working together, that going further together message is definitely something that we are going to hear, all throughout today's sessions. And for these outcomes of carbon storage, soil health, biodiversity, of course, this panel is about, and then water retention and filtration. So when it comes to, what we want for the future of sustainable agriculture, this slide, nicely summarizes that. Lastly, I do want to speak about the pragmatic partnership angle. And, our best agricultural allies on the landscape are those from the livestock sector, our beef and dairy producers that we work with and the organizations that represent them. So land used to raise beef and dairy disproportionately support wildlife and biodiversity habitat. They are truly the guardians of the wetlands and the grasslands, and that's something my colleague Andrea is going to touch on a little bit too, is that wetlands and grasslands under management of livestock operations are less at risk of land conversion, of being turned and developed into something different than in any other practice that's controlling them. So we have a very, very great relationship with the beef and dairy industries in the province as well as across the country, and it's because of the biodiversity impacts that they are providing. And that is a story that doesn't get told very often, and I think we're just really starting to have consumers understand that there is that linkage between habitat, the environment, clean water, biodiversity, all the things that consumers are looking for and demanding from decision makers, can be found in Canada's grasslands. So here is my final message. A little bit of mule deer here in the canola. For anyone in the room that's looking for a conservation partner, and there is a lot of initiatives happening right now where having an environmental non-government organization such as ourselves bringing us to the table really makes sense. So Ducks Unlimited Canada wants to be that sustainability partner, that biodiversity partner on the landscape. We are uniquely positioned to do so. We have on-the-ground conservation work that we do, and we work with everyone on every step of the value chain. And basically, that is my presentation today. So whether you're looking for sustainable landscape solutions or habitat enhancements, so you can have those biodiversity or carbon outcomes, on the land that you work on or the land you influence, because, we have representation here from all across the value chain. We can be that partner, and we're willing to do that work and work with you on those things. So with that, we have the tools in this room, we have the know-how, we have the expertise, and I think, just being here, we have that, want and need to be collaborative, work together, and actually make some change happen when it comes to our landscape, the biodiversity that we have here in Canada that we're so well known for, and just being that global leader that the COP15 messaging has really been, highlighting lately. So anyway, with that, thank you so much.
Wonderful. Andrew, you can come right up while they're getting your slides ready. Think how much time we have left for this session?
I'll be quick. Good morning, everybody. I hope my voice is going to hold out for the duration of my talk here, but it's good to be here this morning. Nice to be back in Manitoba. Thank you, Carson, for pointing that out. And I'm just going to give you a little bit of a brief overview of what the CRSB is and what we do. And I think both Cher and Carly have mentioned a lot of things, so I'll try not to dwell on all the things that have been said already. But we're a relatively new organization, not nearly as wise as Ducks Unlimited Canada, but we started in 2014, and really we were finding that across the supply chain, the beef value chain, everybody was starting to have these conversations about sustainability. So we're kind of brought together as that common place. And Cher mentioned, all the pre-competitive discussions that need to take place. And so bring that together towards a common vision. And so this is just our mission on the screen there. We want to advance, measure, and communicate the continuous improvement in the sustainability of the Canadian beef value chain. So we do that in a number of areas. which I'll go into a little bit, but we do scientific benchmarking and setting some strategic goals. We have a voluntary certification third-party audited program that we have launched in 2017. We have projects and initiatives that really highlight not only what we may be doing as an organization, but there are so many organizations like some of these that have been mentioned already that are doing so much great work for the landscape. And then we've just added most recently in our business strategy this year, communication and engagement as actually a pillar of what we're doing because it's so interlaced in some of these conversations. So just in terms of a level set, how we define beef sustainability is really that economic feasibility, social responsibility, and an environmentally sound product that prioritizes the planet, people, animals, and progress. So it's really an all-encompassing. The 5 icons you see there are our guiding principles that underpin that definition. So we look at natural resources, land, water, and air, supporting our people and communities and workers across the supply chain. Of course, animal health and welfare is a key in the beef production industry. Our food safety, quality, and all those things that go into it, that includes things like food waste, and efficiency and innovation are some of the ways that we get towards these sustainable outcomes. And just want to highlight, this is just a snapshot of our members. So we are a member-based organization, and it just shows the kind of the breadth and depth of everybody that is involved in the CRSB. So we've got everyone from farm to fork, beef producers individually, organizations, the processors, retail and food service companies, many of which Cher mentioned in her presentation, ag and food businesses that really support the beef industry, our NGOs, of course, and scientific researchers like Kim Ominsky that I see at the back of the room are really helping to provide that science-based formation. So again, that pre-competitive, everybody checks their biases at the door and we all come together for that collaborative space where we can all kind of work towards that common vision together. So as I mentioned, these are our 4 pillars of what we do. We started out with the benchmarking piece when we were established. So this encompasses a science-based assessment that looks at the environmental, social, and economic performance of the Canadian beef value chain from farm to fork. And then along with that is a sustainability strategy. So we did the first assessment in 2016, and we committed to repeating that assessment every 5 to 7 years. So we're actually right in the process of repeating that initial assessment. So that gave us the baseline, and now we can show where the progress that has been made. So we established some goals. And over the last couple of years, the whole beef industry has really come together to take those baseline goals and then set our own 2030 goals. But from that initial assessment, I just have highlighted some of the biodiversity-related metrics that came out of that. And so Carly mentioned, the disproportionate capacity for wildlife habitat on lands managed by beef producers in Canada. So we know that we have 2/3 of that habitat on only 1/3 of the agricultural land in Canada. So that's a really important piece when you're looking at, making sure we're not converting that land. So we can keep that and keep that that habitat that helps sequester the carbon and promotes soil health and all of those kinds of things. We also know beef cattle production helps preserve 1.5 billion tons of carbon in Canada. And really that concept of beef cattle being the guardians of the grasslands, helps lots of things, and resilience to droughts and floods and things like that. So these are just a few of the metrics that have come out of that initial assessment. And as I said, we don't have results to share quite yet, but that is coming soon, hopefully in 2023. I mentioned the 2030 goals that the industry set. I've just kind of highlighted there a few of the biodiversity-related ones and environmental ones, but really we've set goals in across 7 broad key areas that the beef industry, again, collaboration is working together on establishing for the industry to move forward. So we've set the goals in 2020 and 2021. We've established a working group for each of those goal areas with experts in the field that we're all working together, and we're just putting together all the action priorities and timelines of how we're going to meet those goals. Another key thing that the CRSB works on is, again, projects and initiatives, and we don't do a lot of this ourselves. We have this very wide membership base, and we really want to highlight the work that's being done to pilot and promote and utilize these innovations. So we've developed an online project inventory. So we have on our website over 60 projects that highlight a vast number of different areas. There are several Ducks Unlimited projects on there. So if you're interested in learning more about what lots of our members and stakeholders are doing across the country, that's a good place to just learn a little bit more. And if you're interested in getting engaged in some of those projects, that's a good way of finding out what's happening. I just wanted to highlight too our SARPAL, which stands for Species at Risk Projects on Agricultural Lands. So this is, again, a partnership. The Canadian Cattle Association, the CRSB, an organization in Alberta called Cows and Fish, the Alberta Conservation Association, have come together and really are working with the farmers and ranchers to develop some of those habitat projects on their land, and it could be something that's really beneficial to the beef operation, like building wildlife-friendly fencing, or things that are going to benefit the operation, and providing the support for the farmers and ranchers to implement some of those projects on their land. So to date, since 2015, over 194,000 acres have been involved in projects. This has mainly happened in Alberta and Southwest Saskatchewan, and there are some key species at risk, such as the sage grouse, that are being targeted with these projects, and there's over 153,000 further acres that are enrolled in the project for the next 2 years coming. So and that project has been funded by the Environment and Climate Change Canada. And the last thing I wanted to just highlight is that the CRSB and Environment and Climate Change Canada have been co-chairing an agricultural core sector planning team for conservation action plans for biodiversity and species at risk. So this is really just to, again, work together, that collaborative effort to develop those conservation action plans that are going to support biodiversity, species at risk within the agricultural sector. And that includes forest, agriculture, and also the urban development needs there. So again, a multi-stakeholder team. There's over 30 participants working together. And I did want to mention too that there's kind of a parallel stream using the 4 directions of learning. So engaging Indigenous elders to make sure that we incorporate that knowledge sharing into that process. So those action plans really are going to help build that strategic policy and the case for those shared collaborative efforts that are happening. And I think the ladies that have spoken ahead of me have really highlighted that biodiversity conversation is coming in fast and furious. So I think I'll leave it there. I know Carson has some questions that we want to talk about, so feel free to find me later if you have any questions. Do you need that?
Nope, I'll just use
Okay.
Great. So I know we are running up on time here, so I'm going to respectfully ask Morris that we have 5 extra minutes into our networking break for one question from me and then potentially a question from the crowd. I get a thumbs up? Okay, all right. So thank you to the panelists for that wonderful discussion. I think it's clear the opportunities that exist within this space, the benefits that biodiversity on the landscape provides, and all the things that industry has been focusing on over the last number of years to address the issue that we're seeing across the landscape. So I guess my question would be, from the moderator perspective, would be what roles can other partners such as governments take in the larger biodiversity discussion? So I'll pass it to Cher first for that.
So The role of government is really to set the stage. I see this as an opportunity for the key stakeholders that are asking for the change to come together, which is why I really wanted to highlight that City of Guelph, while it is a small local project, it has a ton of potential to go national. We need to be engaging the right partners, the private investors, the banks, the insurance companies, those who want to see the changes happening, the industry themselves, retailers, manufacturers. Let them define what the outcomes are and make the investment for that change and use government as policy directive. That's my biased opinion.
Carly?
I'm gonna. Whew, there we go. I know I was listening to myself, didn't sound good. Something we used to do really well, and this is all about investing in extension. And, being able to show producers, that something works. There's always a hesitancy to try something if they don't think it's going to work in their area. And I really think governments, have done a wonderful job historically of that extension, and that knowledge transfer, really showing the research of new technologies. But that's something that really needs to be invested in, and it needs to be collaborative. And we all need to, kind of share in that together to make sure that, producers understand the benefits to them and that it will work in their area. It's not something that happened on the other side of the country. It happens locally. Everything is so hyper-local that, we often talk about, what the federal government is doing or the provincial government, but, our local governments are also really important when it comes to that on-the-ground action that we really need. Municipalities own a lot of land, and they manage a lot of land. And, I actually just spoke to kind of the Manitoba Municipal Relations team a little while ago about this topic specifically, and I think there is a lot of work that can be done right at home locally that we really need to start focusing on.
That's great. Hello. Okay. Yeah, and I'll just add to what Carly was saying, in that we've got some of our baseline information. And we hear a lot from folks across the supply chain. We've got the end users that are wanting to make all these commitments. So we need the metrics and the data. And I think the request for a lot of that data often gets piled onto the producer. And I think especially the primary producer, I think some of them that are in the crowd today would agree with me. So I think the role of government is partially to provide the level playing field so that they can make the decisions that are right for their operations economically and also for, for the public good. And a lot of these things we've seen from some of the goals and strategies that we've put together that, for example, the resiliency to droughts and floods, and that affects everybody. So the public good, I think, is the underlying thing there.
If I can add one more thing, just sort of inspired from that comment, the opportunity for government is also to invest in those really strategic projects to get them up off the ground. The Canadian Agricultural Sustainability Initiative that I talked about really heavily invested early days from government to get it up and running with the end goal of supporting the farmer and the fatigue that's coming from all of the data asks. Right, the investment in these really progressive projects in which we are trying to pilot this idea of paying farmers, that's all coming from these really great strategic projects, and I think that's a good place for investment too.
Great. Well, thank you for those answers. And I think a lot of that was focused on provincial government, municipal governments, and I think there's also a role for Canada to play, right? And there's a lot of global jurisdictions that have a negative opinion on meat production, as an example. So I think the conversation needs to continue to be brought forward from a Canadian level of all the benefits that are provided from our livestock industry. So I think I'll open it up for one question. And I knew Tyler in the back. There's a mic behind you.
Hi there. Tyler Fulton I'm the president of Manitoba Beef Producers, and let me say I think this felt a lot like preaching to the saved for me. We as cattle producers consider ourselves really as biodiversity champions, as you all know. So to be as concise as I can be, I'm going to just read a couple of notes and then follow with a question here. So I think Manitoba, in particular Manitoba cattle producers, are unique amongst farmers in that we're utilizing the natural environment to produce food on the landscape. And a co-product, a different way of looking at it would be a co-product of cattle production is biodiversity. But farmers aren't realizing the value for this product. And to lay things out, cattle production in Manitoba has really struggled to keep pace from a profitability standpoint with other commodity groups. So in thinking about that context, I wonder, how do we realize the value? In what form does it come? I'm skeptical that we can swiftly embed the value of biodiversity within the product that we sell, beef, at scale. I know that there are organizations that are trying it, utilizing different tools to do that. We've got great assessment tools and systems and frameworks to address that. But I remain kind of skeptical that we can lay that onto the consumer and have them value it in the way that I think society should. And so the question I have to the panelists here is, how do we avoid the tragedy of the commons and in the market for biodiversity, who is buying? Is it the consumers? Is it the large food companies? Is it government? In that market for that co-product, who's buying? Thanks.
Yeah. It's such an important question, and I will agree that I too have some skepticism. But what I will say, despite the fact that I have been working on this for 20 plus years, there is a fundamental difference from where we were 20 years ago, talking about how do we even do this, to where we are today in terms of where the market is at. So the market is now demanding companies to take accountability for things like biodiversity and climate. And we have a global recognition that that has to happen. And so for me, that's where my hope comes from. When I look at where I was 20 years ago, nobody would even have the conversation. We were in uncharted territory. Now the whole world is trying to figure out, how do we actually calculate it? And when we have things like the Natural Capital Protocol and companies like Coca-Cola actually reporting it on their balance sheets, that is fundamental change from what we have seen. And for me, that's hope and progression. Are we there? No. Are we within the next 5 to 10 years? Absolutely. I believe we will get there. And I personally have made it my commitment before I retire to make sure it does happen. So that's just me.
So you're retiring when you're 95?
Or tomorrow.
So Cher has a personal commitment to ensure that everyone is well set up before her retirement. But no, I echo those comments too. And I know Andrea is going to speak about some consumer research later, but when it comes to your question specifically about the consumer, my colleague Brenda Mahoney's in here too, so you can always ask her because we worked on this together. But we actually, and many people won't know, have an eco-label, and it's called Habitat Friendly Winter Wheat. And so winter wheat products, it's a certified eco-label that can be attached similar to CRSB certified. And when we initially launched this, we did some consumer research all across Western Canada. And they be willing to pay more for a product, or would they actually select that product over a similar one because it had the eco label? And it was a resounding, yes, they would, as long as the quality was the same and, it wasn't an astronomical amount of price point difference. But you know what, having a partner, a conservation partner, adds that credibility, and consumers are actually seeing that and asking for that because they trust us. We are a credible source, and through all the research we've done and through a lot of what our partners have done, that is showing that consumers are asking for groups like us to be at the table, to have a voice, and really help influence some of these decisions that are happening. But I've been with Ducks for almost 15 years, and if you would have told me 10 years ago this is exactly where we'd be today, I would have called you a liar, because I didn't think it was going to happen as fast, and things do take time. But we are in such a great opportunity right now as an industry across the country, and we really have the responsibility to start taking this really seriously and really supporting the producers we work with. And so we're seeing this with the partners we work with, the consumers and our just stakeholders that we talk to. They are asking and they are demanding this, and I think it's up to all of us to deliver that.
I think, we all talked about collaboration too, and I think that if it's going to work, it's going to have to take, everybody along the chain is going to have to take a share in that valuation as well, And again, the commitments are being made, are requiring things from all points of the supply chain, and I know that's difficult, but we have to be, I think everybody has to be willing to be part of it. And as Carly said, and I'm going to talk a bit about it this afternoon, but yeah, there does seem to be at least a willingness, and we know that consumers are trying to incorporate sustainability into their lifestyle and their eating habits and all of those things. And so, although inflation these last few months might be a little bit, I'm not sure how that's going to affect things, but I think this is a conversation that's not going away. And so, we are working both with our supply chains for sort of market-based solutions, as well as disassociating it from the market, so that we can provide those ecosystems benefits to all that are contributing to it in fairness. Which, Tyler, I'm talking directly to you.
Well, great. Well, thank you again to the panelists. I'm going to land the plane here. Apologies for being over time. Usually I'm a little more stricter on on a schedule, but I think it was really great discussion. Lots of great insight from the panelists. I know I'm probably the only one in the room that's confused of what metrics to look at and to focus on, because sustainability is so complex, but we have the right people in the room to solve that question. So before the panelists leave, we have speaker gifts that we'd like to present you. So.